Rory versus Lawler 2, and Glover versus Jiri. Oh my god. Hello and welcome to the greatest UFC fights of all time bracket. I've gathered 32 of the greatest UFC fights of all time, according to Tapology, so don't get at me about one's missing or not. The Tapology list is linked in the description, so you can go check that out. So I put them all in a bracket, March Madness style, and we're gonna see who comes out on top. This video was inspired by Hive Mind, so go check those guys out. Starting with McDonald versus Lawler 2 and Elkins versus Landwehr. Now, Elkins versus Landwehr, it was a good fight, but pretty sure we know what's happening here. Not much need to be discussed. That was English all the way. Mark Hunt versus Bigfoot Silva. This is the first fight against Max Holloway versus Poirier 2. It's not even really close for me. Max Holloway versus Poirier 2, great fight, but Hunt versus Silva, that was one of the craziest heavyweight fights of all time. The pace that those two heavyweights were fighting at for 5 rounds, insanity. So yeah, that one's gonna move on. Gray Maynard versus Frankie Edgar 2, or Dustin Poirier versus Dan Hooker. Now this one is tough. If you remember, Edgar Gray 2 was that first round where it was just wild. Frankie Edgar got knocked down like 3 times. I don't know how Edgar survived. He came back and won a lot of the rounds and then got a majority draw out of it. But Poirier versus Hooker at the UFC Apex, one of the craziest fights. That second round, I believe it was, absolutely ridiculous. This might be an upset early because Frankie versus Gray 2, that first round was unreal. Unreal. But after that, it was not really, it wasn't the level of madness that Poirier versus Hooker was for so long. So this might upset some OG fans, but I'm moving Poirier versus Hooker up. I gotta do it. Glover versus Jiri and Usman versus Colby 1. Sorry that these are so close, I couldn't really do anything. Glover versus Jiri. Glover up on the scorecards. Jiri gets the sub in the 5th round, and also another 5th round finish here between Usman and Colby. An amazing striking match between 2 wrestlers. Was a much better fight than people were expecting initially. I think the swings in the Glover versus Jiri fight, when Jiri would get either hurt or mounted against Glover Teixeira, like in an arm triangle, and then just escape. The way Jiri survived all those moments on the ground, I think it made it more of a versatile and wild fight, and the ending was super unexpected, even more than Usman getting a knockout in the 5th against Colby. So I think I'm gonna lean Glover versus Jiri here. Then we go Rob versus Yoel 2, and then Costa versus Yoel. The matchups of Yoel fights. Now, Costa versus Yoel, an absolutely insane 3-round fight. Both guys absolutely shredded to the gills, both rocking each other at points in that fight. But Rob versus Yoel 2, for me, is one of the greatest fights of all time. Rob being so much more active, hitting Yoel with head kicks, hitting Yoel with everything that he had, and Yoel just tanking it and then rocking him on multiple occasions. Between the 2 Yoel fights, I think because the Rob versus Yoel one was 5 rounds, kind of with the championship on the line, like sort of. I'm gonna have to lean Rob versus Yoel 2 on this one. Just overall a crazier fight. Lawler versus Condit, and Poirier versus Jung. Now, Poirier versus Jung was like way at the bottom, so I think we know where we're going with this one. That Robbie Lawler title run, I don't think I need to reiterate it. One of the craziest title runs ever. Kind of reminds me of the Oliveira title run. With that being said, let's just move Lawler versus Condit up to the 2nd round. And then Izzy versus Kelvin, and Mir versus Nogueira 2. Now, a tough one as well. If you remember Mir versus Nogueira 2, this was the one where he broke Nogueira's arm in the Kimura. Unbelievable scramble to get to that position. Let's be honest here, a 5-round war between Izzy and Kelvin. I don't know. Israel Adesanya versus Kelvin Gastelum is moving on for me. And then Diaz versus Connor 2 versus Figgy and Moreno 1. One of the 4. Definitely the best one out of the 4. Diaz versus Connor 2 and Diaz versus Connor 1 are on this list. That fight is on the other side. I think that's a little bit odd to have those fights in there instead of some other ones that I was looking for, but either way, they are gigantic fights. And Diaz versus Connor 2 was an actual pretty good back and forth fight. But Figgy versus Moreno 1, I don't know if this is an upset here. For me, it's pretty easy. It's Figgy versus Moreno 1. I get like the magnitude of Diaz Connor, but I'm just thinking fights. And we go Jones versus Gus 1 and Liddell versus Vanderlei. This one, is a pretty lopsided W for Jones versus Gus for me. Liddell versus Silva was a great fight, but they kind of made it like 3 or 4 years too late. They wanted to make that fight immediately after the Pride and UFC split up. They wanted to do it when they sent Liddell to Pride to win the tournament, but then he lost to Rampage Jackson. It was very highly anticipated back in that day, but I don't think it holds a candle to Jones versus Gus 1, one of the craziest fights of all time. Move it up there. And then we go Anderson Silva versus the GOAT Chael Sonnen. Gaethje versus Chandler. Now this is an interesting one because Chael versus Anderson 1 was not competitive at all. Disregard the memes that you know of Chael being undefeated, undisputed. This fight wasn't close at all. Chael dominated 4 rounds and however long it was, like 2 minutes. He absolutely dominated the fight, dropping Anderson Silva on the feet and just wrestling him the whole time. Domination from Chael Sonnen. And then obviously one of the craziest comebacks in UFC history with that triangle submission that Anderson Silva got. But if we're thinking, like, if Chael just doesn't get submitted, this fight is not even in the greatest fights of all time because it's not even competitive. But since that comeback, it's crazy. And then, on the other side, it's Gaethje versus Chandler, which was a wild fight. I know Gaethje loves to say that it wasn't even competitive, but Chandler rocked him multiple times. The wrestling exchanges where Chandler tries to pick him up, like that fight was madness. And 3 rounds, I think that fight was more back and forth. And I think if Silva didn't submit him, it just would have been like Chael dominant. And it wouldn't even be considered in this list. So I think I'm going to go Gaethje versus Chandler here. That might anger some people, but I don't know. That's a more competitive, crazy fight to watch while you were watching it. When you were watching the Silva versus Chael one, you're like, holy shit, Chael is the GOAT. And then we go Aldo versus Chad 2 and Eddie Alvarez and Gaethje. Now this will be a run of Gaethje fights coming up here because Gaethje is just a madman. Alvarez versus Gaethje was a very good fight. Alvarez ripping the body with hooks. He was the first guy to defeat Justin Gaethje, and Justin Gaethje was just pressuring forward, throwing leg kicks, battered Alvarez's legs, just like he battered everyone's legs in this little run of fights for him. Alvarez just eventually got through and with the knee to the head. That was a crazy fight. I think 5 rounds, Aldo versus Chad. I think Aldo versus Chad 2 was just a little bit more entertaining. I think I'm gonna move Aldo versus Chad 2 up in the list here. And then we go Gaethje versus Poirier against Gaethje versus Johnson. So pick your poison with the Justin Gaethje fights. Gaethje versus Johnson, a wild one. And then Gaethje versus Poirier. Gaethje ate the fuck up. That doesn't even make sense. Gaethje ate Poirier's inside leg up. Like, just battered it over and over. And Gaethje did a similar thing to Michael Johnson as well, and eventually got the finish. You can't really go wrong with this pick. I'm gonna go Gaethje versus Poirier. Yeah. Then we go Shogun versus Hendo 1 against Diaz versus Conor 1. Now this is the most lopsided blowout in the whole bracket. It shouldn't even be talked about why this is the case. Diaz versus Conor 1. Yeah, Conor got off to a good start in the first round, blew his load, and then gassed out, and Diaz just swarmed it on him. Obviously, a very shocking fight in the moment, but Shogun versus Hendo 1 is one of the craziest fights I've ever seen. I was watching this fight back. That fight was unreal, and that's easily moving on. Cub Swanson versus Doo Ho Choi against Matt Hughes versus Trig 2. Matt Hughes versus Trig 2, very wild fight. Trig takes the back, has the rear naked choke. You think it's over, but Hughes escapes it, picks him up, runs him all the way to the other side of the octagon, and slams him, gets on his back, rear naked choke. So that sequence of events is pretty wild, but I don't think it's gonna beat Cub versus Choi. Cub versus Choi clears here for me, even though Hughes versus Trig 2 is underrated fight. Very good fight, but it's Cub versus Choi. And then we go to the fight that saved the UFC pretty much. Griffin versus Bonner 1, RIP Stephan Bonner, very sad, against Ferguson versus Edson Barboza. Now, Ferguson versus Edson Barboza, another crazy fight. Ended pretty early when we're talking about these greatest fights of all time, but it was crazy while it lasted. Ferguson with that pressure, throwing elbows, and Edson being Edson, one of the scariest kickers and kickboxers in the game. Ferguson just overwhelmed him. One of the greatest Tony Ferguson performances for sure. But either way, Griffin versus Bonner, for sure. Moving on to the next round. Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and Melendez versus Sanchez. Now this one is tough. Melendez versus Sanchez has some iconic moments where they're just both swinging madness. But overall, this is the greatest women's fight of all time. The only women's fight that is on here, I'm going to have to move Weili Zhang and Joanna past into the second round. So now, let's get into the second round. Rory versus Lawler 2 against Mark Hunt and Bigfoot Silva. This is a very tough matchup for Bigfoot and Mark Hunt, which is one of the greatest fights ever for sure, but it is facing against an absolute titan. It's not an easy one for me. It's not an easy one. It's not as easy as people may think. Rory versus Lawler has an absolutely legendary mystique about it. I don't know. It was an unbelievable fight, but so was Mark Hunt versus Bigfoot. Okay, hear me out. I've watched both fights multiple times. Hunt versus Silva, like, it was a more entertaining fight to watch for me, Hunt versus Silva. I might have to go against, like, I was more entertained by the Hunt and Silva fight, if I'm honest, but I think Rory versus Lawler 2 was a better fight. I don't know if that makes any sense, but Rory versus Lawler 2 is going to move on. Poirier versus Hooker and Glover versus Jiri. Poirier versus Hooker is definitely one of my favorite fights of all time, but I don't think it can beat Glover versus Jiri. Man, those grappling exchanges in the Glover versus Jiri fight and the fact that Jiri subbed him, like that, who would have thought that would have happened? I think Glover versus Jiri moves on. Sad to see Poirier versus Hooker get eliminated, but Glover versus Jiri, legendary. Rob versus Yoel 2 against Lawler versus Condit. That is a tough one. I'm leaning Rob versus Yoel 2 because the way Rob was getting hurt in that fight, like, it looked like Rob was going to get finished multiple times, but the way he survived, using like front kicks against the cage, just like doing anything he could to survive, and then the output he was putting on Yoel, those stomps that he was using against Yoel because Yoel stomped on him the first time. I think I might have to lean Raw versus Yoel 2 here. This is only going to get tougher. Izzy versus Kelvin, Figgy versus Moreno. I think Izzy versus Kelvin gets it here. Obviously love Figgy versus Moreno, but I think Izzy versus Kelvin. Jones versus Gus 1 versus Gaethje versus Chandler. Lots of verses in that. I think Jones versus Gus clears this one. Aldo versus Chad 2 and Gaethje versus Poirier. I think I gotta go Aldo versus Chad 2. That was an amazing fight. If you haven't watched that fight, go watch that. Gaethje versus Poirier, obviously amazing as well. Then we got Shogun versus Hendo 1 against Cub Swanson and Ho Choi. What a crazy matchup. The thing that Cub versus Choi doesn't have going for it is that it was a 3-round fight. And Shogun versus Hendo was wild for all 5. So I think I'm going to have to lean Shogun versus Hendo. That is one of the craziest fights I've ever seen. Another very serious contender. This is a tough one. Griffin versus Bonner 1. A 3-round fight. The history behind that fight, like the fact that it pretty much saved the UFC. But Weili versus Joanna, the greatest women's fight of all time. 5 rounds. I think I'm going to go Weili and Joanna. That might be a big upset as well, but either way, I'm doing it. Weili versus Joanna. 3rd round matchups. Rory versus Lawler 2 and Glover versus Jiri. Oh my god. I think I might go with the underdog here. I don't know. This could definitely be recency bias, but I just watched these fights. But I think Glover versus Jiri is crazier than Lawler versus Rory. Glover versus Jiri moves on. Please leave your angry comments in the comment section. But I got Glover versus Jiri. I don't know what to say. Rob versus Yoel 2 and Izzy versus Kelvin. Oh man. I think I'm going to go Rob versus Yoel. I think Rob versus Yoel moves on. Very close though. That's one of the tightest ones. I think this is where the run of Aldo versus Chad 2 comes to an end. They've moved on past 2 Gaethjes. But they run into Jones versus Gus 1. Hall of Fame fight. It's got to move on. I think this is where the end of Weili and Joanna comes. This matchup, for me, is clearly Shogun versus Hendo. It was a good run for Weili and Joanna. Go women. But we're going to have to... They're going to have to be eliminated here. It was a good run. Semi-final matchup. Glover versus Jiri versus Rob versus Yoel 2. I said versus a few times again. I think if Glover versus Jiri beats Rory and Lawler, I think you know where I'm going with this one. I don't know. Glover versus Jiri is the, like, I don't know. It's just the craziest fight. It's one of the craziest fights of all time. And I think it's going to move on here. Like I said, the grappling exchanges, I think, just put it over the edge. Because the striking is just as crazy, and then the grappling. Like, you think it's over. But somehow, Jiri survives. Escapes a fully locked in head and arm with that fucking rollover defense. And then subs him. Glover versus Jiri moves on. Good run for Raw versus Yoel 2. One of the greatest fights of all time, but it ran into a fucking juggernaut in my mind. Glover versus Jiri moves on to the finals. And then we go over to this side of the bracket. Jones versus Gus 1 and Shogun versus Hendo 1. Now, Jones versus Gus 1 has had a relatively smooth run to get to the semifinals. Again, tough little matchup, Aldo versus Chad 2, but Jones versus Gus 1 had it. But I think this is where it gets eliminated because Shogun Hendo, like rewatching that fight was unreal. Unreal. And I think it was just a little bit better than Jones versus Gus. I think Jones versus Gus gets elevated because it's like, oh, that was John Jones and no one thought Gustafsson was going to do good. But Gus did really good. And it was a great fight. Obviously, it made it to the semifinals. But I don't think it was as good in back and forth as Shogun versus Hendo. So, I'm going to move Shogun versus Hendo up into the finals. And that creates a finals matchup between Glover versus Jiri and Shogun versus Hendo. Wow. This is unbelievably difficult. I can't even begin to... Oh my god. I know there are still people mad from the Rory versus Lawler one. And they're like, he's going to pick Glover versus Jiri because it just beat out that fight. But man, Shogun versus Hendo was crazy. This is like a coin flip for me. 50-50. I think I gotta go with Shogun versus Hendo. I think in that fight there were more knockdowns. Both guys getting knocked down. I don't think that happened in Glover versus Jiri. I don't think Jiri got a knockdown on Glover. But like I was saying earlier, the grappling exchanges and that are crazy. But I think I'll have to lean Shogun versus Hendo. Number 1. So, with that being said, Shogun versus Hendo 1 wins the bracket. Take a look at my bracket. I'll try to line it up. There we are. That is my final bracket. Some of you might be upset with the Rory Lawler elimination early. What else? I don't know. Maybe Jones versus Gus. But let me know where you would have gone different than me. But either way, Shogun versus Hendo 1 is the champion of the greatest UFC fights of all time bracket. Thank you for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, let me know some other bracket ideas you want me to do, and I will gladly do them. This was a ton of fun. That being said,